Questions without notice. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm Senator Cash will be fighting the federal court's order to give evidence over her and her office's involvement in leaking information about an AFP raid? Why is the minister refusing to give evidence under oath? Why is it that the minister will say to a media conference or even to the parliament, but not under oath?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the unions, the AWU, supported by the honourable member, is doing everything it can to stop the Registered Organisations Commission from finding out whether the Leader of the Opposition paid $100,000 of AWU members' money to get up without authorisation. That's what it's about. So the issue is this. The
members for Griffith and
opposite
Bendigo Award
is one of Her Majesty's Counsel learned in the law and no doubt believes in the rule of law. No, he is. He is. He's a QC. He is. And he's a lawyer. As another great lawyer said, anyone can go to jail if they get the right lawyer. It's important to have the right one. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Isaacs knows very well that it would be a very, very serious matter if a union paid $100,000 of its members' funds to get up without authorisation.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left. The manager. Members on my left. The member for McMahon. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has failed to refer to the person who is the subject of the question. The person who has been subpoenaed is Senator Cash.
I thank the Manager of Opposition Business for his question, but the Prime Minister is referring to the policy substance of the question. I'll keep listening carefully. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, Senator Cash is not a party to the proceedings. The wrongdoing, suspected wrongdoing that is being investigated is the payment of $100,000 by the Leader of the Opposition to get up. Now, if he did that with authority, all we need to see is the minutes of the Executive Committee meeting approving it with an affidavit from the Secretary saying it's a true and correct record. Very simple. That's all that the Leader of the Opposition needs to provide. And armed with such a great legal adviser as the member for Isaacs, the Leader of the Opposition would know this. So a reasonable person observing the failure of the Leader of the Opposition to prove the payment was authorised and the determination of the union to stop the payment being investigated can only assume that the payment was not authorised. And that's the cover-up, that's the wrong, that's the shameful act that the Labor Party and the member for Isaacs are trying to cover up and obfuscate.
The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's plan for a stronger economy is providing relief for households and families and guaranteeing the essential services Australians rely on, including in my electorate of Bonner?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, just the member for Jagga and the Minister for Home Affairs will just cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. And just a few weeks ago, I was with the honourable member in his electorate where we saw firsthand the benefits of a stronger economy that makes everything we seek to achieve in our economic plan possible. It means businesses have the confidence to invest and create jobs. To create last calendar year, Mr Speaker, the most jobs in any calendar year in our nation's history, over 415,000 jobs. And it's why our policies are focused on delivering every incentive and encouragement we can for Australian businesses. Now, more than 1 million jobs have been created since the coalition was elected in 2013. Overwhelmingly private sector jobs in less than 5 years. And, Mr Speaker, our budget is the next step in our national economic plan. It's a budget that provides tax relief for hard-working Australians, for families and households, lower taxes, better services. We're able to deliver this while balancing the budget a year ahead of schedule because we've made the responsible decisions, restrained spending, and the government has lived within its means. And that means we're able to deliver lower, fairer and simpler taxes for middle and lower income Australians. 4.4 million receiving relief of $530 next year and around 10 million Australians benefiting in total. And because of the comprehensive nature of our personal income tax plan, it deals with bracket creep. And, Mr Speaker, by the time the plan is complete in 24-25, 94% of Australians will never face a marginal tax rate of more than 32.5 cents. And, Mr Speaker, that means that middle-income earners will be vastly better off under our plan than what the Labor Party has attempted to offer up as an alternative. We're talking about teachers and nurses, electricians and mechanics. These are the types of occupations who will be substantially better off under our plan than Labor's alternative, because they will only be paying a top marginal rate of 32.5 cents, which Labor is refusing to support now, having voted for it in the House. They now say they'll oppose it in the Senate, and yet it is middle Australia that will benefit from this, to the tune of thousands of dollars in many cases. These are the people the Labor Party used to claim to defend but have now abandoned. Our tax plan offers fairer, simpler, more equitable taxes, and above all, it gives people more of the money they have earned. It's their money, not the government's, and they're entitled to keep as much of it as they can.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer. If Senator Cash has nothing to hide from the federal court, why won't she show up?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Why don't you show up? Mr Speaker, look, the determination of the Labor Party to try to distract from the fact that the Australian Workers' Union, the Leader of the Opposition, is doing everything they can to cover up the payment of $100,000 to get up without authority is extraordinary. That's the issue. The issue is other people's money. It's other people's money. It's paying other people's money without authority. That's what this is about. And the Leader of the Opposition wants to get up and go on about business, and he complains and says we're always supporting business. Well, what about this? What about $100,000 of AWU members' money paid to get up without authority? Is that okay? Is that all right? Oh, it was a long time ago, I remember the Leader of the Opposition says.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, this question asks nothing other than why won't the Minister turn up. Nothing else in it at all.
The Manager of Opposition Business resume his seat. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The member for Barton is warned. As I said in my previous ruling, the question is on the topic of the case, and the Prime Minister's answer is in response to the question. I just need to point out to members on both sides I'm listening very carefully given the subject matter, and I'm looking for a range of matters that might breach the practice, including sub judice and reflection on members and all the rest. But I've heard the Manager of Opposition Business, but I think it's too much to ask that essentially try and censor the Prime Minister's answer when the question is on the topic of the case. He's sticking to the topic of the case, and I believe he's being relevant to the question that was asked. Has the Prime Minister completed his answer? He has. The member for Bennelong has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the government's plan for a stronger economy is providing relief for Australian households who are looking to get ahead? And does the Treasurer know of any different courses of action?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Bennelong for his question. He knows that the budget this year was once again our plan for a stronger economy that is happening under this coalition government that has seen more than 1 million jobs created since we first came to office back in 2013. The budget this year contains a responsible plan to provide tax relief to working Australians, centred on middle-income earning Australians. It also continues the responsible plan to ensure that Australians face lower electricity prices under a Turnbull government. The personal tax plan that we've outlined provides $140 billion worth of tax relief to working Australians. $140 billion over the next decade. And, Mr Speaker, what the Labor Party did when they came into this place last week is they sought to strip away $70 billion worth of tax relief for working Australians. Why would they do that? They voted to strip out Step 2 of the plan, which deals with bracket creep. They voted to strip out Step 3 of the plan, which deals with making a simpler tax system, where the Prime Minister rightly said that 94% of Australians would no longer face above a 32.5% tax rate. 32.5 cents would be the highest marginal tax rate they would ever face. And by opposing Step 2, it means that someone today who is earning actually less than $80,000, around just a bit over $76,000, they will face a higher tax rate under the Labor Party than they would under this government, Mr Speaker, because this government wants to deal with that with bracket creep, and the opposition, the Labor Party, wants to keep bracket creep for itself and spend it on whatever pops into their head, Mr Speaker. But Step 3 of that plan, if that plan is not supported, if Step 3 of that plan is not supported, then it means that mine apprentices, teachers, forklift drivers, excavators, police sergeants, crane operators, riggers, Mr Speaker, TAFE workers, all of them will face a higher rate of tax under the Labor Party than they will under the plan that we have brought into this place. Now, they have a simple way. They only have to do one thing to ensure that all of those occupations, Mr Speaker, don't face a higher rate of tax, and that is vote for the personal tax plan. But it's not only higher taxes that Australians will pay more for under the Labor government, they will also pay more for electricity. As a result of the Labor Party's reckless ideological targets, Mr Speaker, they will face higher electricity prices. Under this side of the House, under the Turnbull government, we have a responsible, measured, credible plan supported by the National Energy Security Board, which will see lower electricity prices in this country. Under the Labor Party, you cannot trust them at the end of the day, because you will pay more under Labor, because their tax policies are driven by envy and their energy policies are driven by ideology.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister have confidence that each statement Minister Cash has made to the Parliament in relation to the circumstances surrounding the Australian Federal Police raids of the AWU was truthful?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I have complete confidence in the Minister, Senator Cash, and I just return to the central fact. Now you've raised the issue. The AWU has issued a subpoena to Senator Cash. This is the third. Sorry, the court has at the request of the AWU. Yes, of course. Thank you.
Member for Lindsay.
On the application of the union, the court issued the subpoena. This is the third subpoena. One was substantially set aside. The other was completely set aside. Now, Senator Cash is entitled to seek to set aside a subpoena if it's judged not relevant. That is a legal matter for the court. Again, the rule of law must prevail. But the central issue, the reason there are court proceedings at all, is because the Registered Organisation Commission is seeking to determine whether the Leader of the Opposition paid $100,000 of his members' money to get up without authority. Now, I think all honourable members would agree if the Leader of the Opposition was paying $100,000 of his members' money to get up without authority, that would be a very, very serious wrong, a very serious act of misconduct, misappropriating other people's money. Now, the union has taken action to stop the Registered Organisations Commission investigating this. And the question is why? Because it would be very easy to prove. Plenty of lawyers on that side, all they would need is the minutes of the meeting, duly attested and proved, and that would demonstrate that the payment was made with authority. Why hasn't it been produced? And no wonder people increasingly believe they cannot trust the Leader of the Opposition with other people's money, let alone with the management of our economy.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. Just before I call the member for Denison, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon former Minister and Member for Bass, the Honourable Warwick Smith. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you, and I call the member for Denison.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Tasmanians are anxious right now about the GST and whether or not the formula will be changed to our disadvantage. This is a separate matter from your Braddon by-election promise that Tasmania will not see its dollar amount of GST reduced. So, Prime Minister, when will the government respond to the final report of the Productivity Commission inquiry into the GST and in particular make clear the government's intention regarding the formula? And, Prime Minister, most importantly, will you now commit to not change the GST formula to Tasmania's disadvantage?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I acknowledge the gentleman from Tasmania has asked the question in the presence of one of his distinguished predecessors from the Tasmanian House of Representatives team. Mr Speaker, the government has been given the Productivity Commission's final report on horizontal fiscal equalisation, which examined our system for determining how GST revenue is distributed among states and territories. This will be released within weeks, not months, but we obviously have to go through it and read it carefully. The government is committed to release the report in June. As the Treasurer has committed, both Cabinet and the state and territory treasurers will have the opportunity to be briefed on the report before it's published. There will still be an exhaustive process that follows the Productivity Commission's report release. We'll consider its recommendations and work with the states and territories to come up with a package of reforms. It's important we take the time fully to examine any proposed changes to our system of horizontal fiscal equalisation and to understand state and territory views and perspectives. It's also important that any new arrangements are seen as being fair everywhere. They have to pass the pub test in Burnie as they do in Bunbury or Ballarat or Bendigo, right around the country. And, Mr Speaker, I can say to the honourable member, whatever changes are made to the GST to make it fairer or more transparent, the payments to Tasmania will not be reduced by a cent. Tasmania will not lose a cent, and we will ensure that.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on reforms to the superannuation system that the government is pursuing for the benefit of all Australians, including those in my electorate of Chisholm? Is the minister aware of any other ideas that would put this at risk?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Chisholm for her question, and I note that she works so incredibly hard for her constituents, and she always puts their interests first. She recognises the significance of the superannuation system to the well-being of millions of Australians, and she knows that that importance cannot be overstated. It is, of course, a mandatory system, a system where it is incumbent upon every single person to make a contribution to their retirement savings. And we, as a government, are taking action to ensure that superannuation works for members. As announced in the budget, the government is going to protect the superannuation of millions of Australians by capping administration and investment fees, by banning exit fees, by improving the insurance arrangements that apply, and by proactively reuniting people with their own money through the Australian Taxation Office. Those opposite may wish to note that the government is providing more power to the Australian Taxation Office to detect and to punish those employers who don't pay their superannuation entitlements. In fact, we are going to put them in jail, including 12 months in jail for the most egregious cases. Now, this, of course, is something that the Labor Party never did when they were in office. They talk a big game, but they are very poor when it comes to follow through. The government also has legislation in the Senate which would remove restrictions on Australians being able to choose their own superannuation fund. At the moment, there are around 1 million Australians who have no choice in terms of the fund that they put their money into. And this is particularly egregious for those people who have previous employment and a previous fund where they might be paying multiple sets of fees and multiple sets of insurance premiums. The government has also introduced legislation to improve the powers of the regulator to make sure that we have greater transparency over how funds use members' money. And we want to make sure that those funds are accountable to members whose retirement savings that they are looking after. We, of course, recognise this is a $2.7 trillion sector and we must protect members' interests. So who is standing in the way of these reforms? Who stands against it? Vested interests and those opposite. Those opposite do not want to end the rip-offs and the superannuation rorts. As Paul Kelly puts it so well in today's Australian, the test for Labor is whether it puts the institutional power of the super system before the millions of people who are being exploited. And we ask that question, will Labor stand with us and millions of Australians? I think the answer.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
I'd ask the Minister to table a copy of the legislation she just demanded we support.
What about super?
There's no point of order. The Minister was merely referring to legislation. The member for Gorton.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that Minister Cash's ministerial career has included misleading the Senate 5 times,
could the Minister just begin his question again? There was something I had difficulty hearing.
Goodness me, Chris. Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that Minister Cash's ministerial career has included misleading the Senate 5 times, running an office that undermined an AFP raid, appointing an ABCC commissioner despite knowing of allegations he'd broken the very law he was sworn to uphold, and now being ordered by the federal court to give evidence regarding leaking information about an AFP raid? Prime Minister, why is Minister Cash still there?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, Senator Cash is doing a better job protecting workers than the honourable member does, let alone the Leader of the Opposition does. Handing over hard-working members' money to get up without authority. What do they call that down at the Court of Petty Sessions?
Prime Minister will just pause for a second. I think I understand the point of order you're going to raise. Do you want to just let me have a go, and if it's something different, then prop up? Prime Minister was reflecting on the Leader of the Opposition when he made a direct accusation. It's different from posing a question, if I can put it that way. So the Prime Minister does need to withdraw that.
Yes, I withdraw that.
Prime Minister has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, the question is which the Registered Organisations Commission is investigating, as is its duty, is whether members' money was paid to get up without authority. That's the question. That's what they're seeking to investigate. And you would think that the moment the ROC inquired, the union would have said, of course, it was fully authorised. Oh, here are the minutes, here's all the evidence. But no, the union has done everything it can to obstruct the investigation, and the opposition is doing everything it can to support the AWU in obstructing that investigation. What we're talking about here is $100,000 of members' money. Was it paid with authority or not? If it was, then let's hear why it was paid. Let's see the evidence. Why won't the Leader of the Opposition and the union produce the evidence? And why do they wonder? Why are they surprised that people are starting to believe it was not paid with authority, it was paid in an unauthorised way? Why do they imagine people wouldn't think that, given the opportunity to provide the evidence has been given, but it has not been provided? So the ball is very much in the court of the AWU and the Leader of the Opposition. Where is the evidence that this money was paid to get up with authority? It's pretty basic. Looking after members' interests, looking after members' money, putting members first, doing the right thing by the workers. These are all the things the Leader of the Opposition has claimed he did. And we know about the penalty rates he traded away again and again. But this is cold, hard cash. $100,000. Was it given to get up with authority or not?
Just before I call the honourable member for Latrobe, I'd like to inform the House we also have present in the gallery this afternoon the Australian Political Exchange Council's 12th delegation from New Zealand. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the government's investment in vital infrastructure connecting local communities and creating local jobs? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any risks to job creation?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and a good question about jobs. We should be hearing questions about jobs and innovation rather than the muckraking and tearing down that we're hearing from those opposite. So I'm glad to get a question from our side about jobs, about innovation, about infrastructure, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his question. He's a tireless fighter. He's a tireless fighter for his local community, for Victoria and for the infrastructure and the jobs that our nation needs. This government is delivering. 1 million jobs have been created. 1 million jobs have been created throughout Australia, including in Victoria and in Tasmania, thanks to this government's strong economic plan, a plan which has taken the pressure off small and medium businesses through tax cuts and the instant asset write-off, extended for another 12 months in the Treasurer's excellent budget, a plan which will see Australians keeping more of their money, more of their hard-earned money in their pockets through our personal income tax cuts, and a plan which is delivering for vital infrastructure needed to boost economy, connect local communities and create local jobs. It's all about productivity. The member's electorate is benefiting from a $500 million investment in the Monash Freeway, connecting his region with Melbourne and other parts of regional Victoria. The constituents of Latrobe will be amongst those in the region to benefit from our commitment to the Melbourne Airport Rail Link, $5 billion, which will deliver the much-needed, long-called-for rail link between Tullamarine and the CBD. But the member asked me more broadly about infrastructure connecting local communities, and I'm delighted to inform him of the government's infrastructure investment also in Tasmania. And Warwick Smith, the former member for Bass, will also be delighted to hear this. In the north-west and in the west of Tasmania, in the seat of Braddon. The seat of Braddon, indeed, this government has delivered. Gawler River, Stony Point Creek and Zeehan Rivulet Bridge replacements, $3.5 million for 8 community infrastructure projects under the Regional Jobs and Investment program, a wonderful initiative, including the Wild Mercy Mountain Bike Trails project, the Burnie Waterfront Eastern Promenade, and a project unlocking export opportunities for seed potato production in the Apple Isle. $11.1 million for a number of projects under the Community Development Grants program, including the Devonport Gymnastics Club project and a new community facility on King Island, building community capacity, creating local jobs. I'm asked about the risks, and they're those opposite, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, he stands opposed to jobs creation, he stands opposed to higher wages for Tasmanians, he stands opposed to business growth. Can't understand why he is so anti-business, so anti-startups, particularly in Tasmania. The Leader of the Opposition is a clear and present danger to the continued growth, prosperity, job creation and hard-earned wages of all Tasmanians.
The member for Hotham.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When did the Prime Minister or his office become aware Minister Cash had been ordered by the federal court to give evidence over her and her office's involvement in leaking information about an AFP raid?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, if the honourable member's question is when did I become aware that a subpoena had been issued today, then it was this morning. I heard about it this morning. And the fact is, this is the third time a subpoena has been issued. There was one that was I just refer the honourable member to the order of there's a court order setting aside one of the previous subpoenas, and the judge, the court said, while the minister may have an interest in the outcome of the proceedings, she's not a party to it, and not be burdened with making substantial inquiries in the search for documents unless and until it's apparent the documents sought may be of assistance to the AWU's case. So the minister has said that her lawyers will apply to set aside this subpoena as they have the previous ones, and the court will make a decision. But the honourable member should recognise that the issue in the proceedings does not relate to Senator Cash. The issue here is about an attempt to stop the Registered Organisation Commission from finding out whether $100,000 of AWU members' money was lawfully paid or not. I mean, that is a legitimate inquiry. Do honourable members opposite seriously believe that does the member for Batman, distinguished trade unionist herself, does she seriously believe that the payment of union members' money to an activist group should be done with authority or not? That's the question. I mean, that is the question. She may think that paying tax is a privilege, but I don't think that union members believe paying their dues is a privilege. They believe it's paid to the union to represent them, right? To represent them. And handing it out to GetUp without authority, surely that should affront the honour and the decency of every trade unionist opposite. But they all seem, Mr Speaker, to be determined to do everything they can to stop the Registered Organisation Commission finding out whether $100,000 of AW members' hard-earned cash was paid to GetUp without authority. Surely the truth should out, and the Leader of the Opposition and the union should explain whether it was paid with authority or not, and stop trying to obstruct this investigation.
The member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House how a stronger economy enables the government to deliver affordable access to high-cost, life-changing medicines for diseases such as renal cancer? Have other governments delivered these kind of outcomes in the same way?
No. The minister has the call.
Thank you very much.
Member for Macarthur. The minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I think the answer about other governments is no, they haven't. No, they have not, and we will deal with that. Now, I want to thank the member for Brisbane, and in particular note that he had a tremendous career before coming to this place, including being the CEO of the National Retail Association. And one of the things that he learned in that role is that whether you want to grow a small business or an economy, you need a plan. And in order to do that, that plan starts with competitiveness, the ability to deliver better service more efficiently and more effectively. And in order to do that, as an economy, you have to be able to deliver more jobs. And we are delivering 1 million extra jobs. And that's what allows us, 1 million extra jobs is what allows us to guarantee essential services. And those essential services include record funding for Medicare with an additional $4.8 billion, record funding for aged care with an additional $5 billion, record funding for mental health with another $338 million, and record funding for hospitals with an additional $30 billion. Now, in mentioning hospitals, I should note that only a week and a half ago I accompanied the member for Brisbane to the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. Now, it's a great hospital, and we made a major announcement in terms of ensuring that there is better resistance to antimicrobial challenges, so making real progress. But it's interesting. The Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital is in the Metro North area of Queensland. And I saw something about hospital funding recently. I saw a statement from a former member of this House, Susan Lamb, who talked about don't cut money from Caboolture Hospital, which is also in the Metro North area. And you know what? You know what? I thought to myself, did we cut funds? No. But we added $120 million in the last budget. Did Labor in Queensland cut funds? Yes, they did. They cut $21 million from the Caboolture Hospital region, which is the Metro North region. And you do the same. You compare what we've done in relation to new medicines and what the ALP did. What we did on the weekend is we listed Cabometex, a new medicine for renal cancer. This can help people save lives and protect lives. I met Gil, who said that he believed with this medicine early next year he would have the chance of walking his daughter down the aisle. That is about saving lives. But let me say this. That has not always been the approach of the other side. 7 medicines they deliberately delayed. 7 new medicines, including in vitro fertilisation and endometriosis. And why?
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Gorton.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that Minister Cash misled the Senate on 5 separate occasions, hid behind a whiteboard at her last appearance at Senate estimates, and despite being in the building right now, hasn't even bothered showing up at Senate estimates? Prime Minister, if Minister Cash can't do her job, why does he still have one?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. If the Leader of the Opposition can't prove that he had authority to pay $100,000 of his members' money to get up, why should we believe that he did?
The member for Murray.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of a strong, consistent and united approach to border protection? Is the Minister aware of any risks to what the government has achieved?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and everybody on this side of the parliament, Mr Speaker, was absolutely determined to make sure that we stopped boats, got the children out of detention, closed the 17 detention centres, because we didn't want to see Mr Speaker, want to see the dysfunction that existed under the Labor Party. We didn't want to see men, women and children drowning at sea. We didn't want to see those kids in detention, and we, Mr Speaker, have made decisions which have resulted in securing our borders. So it is quite amazing that many members opposite are running around at the moment trying to work out ways in which they could dismantle the policy of this government, which has stopped the drownings at sea, has stopped the children going into detention and has stopped new boat arrivals. And, Mr Speaker, it's interesting to note that on the weekend there was a conference in Victoria with the ALP putting forward a motion to try and stop Operation Sovereign Borders and unwind the policies that we had presided over. Now, Mr Speaker, you would have thought that there would be a debate and that those on the left would have been allowed to put their opinions as to why they wanted to trash the successful policy of stopping the boats. But, Mr Speaker, the difficulty is that the Leader of the Opposition didn't want that debate to take place. So what did he do? He called on his old mates from the CFMEU. Now, Mr Speaker, normally the CFMEU closed down building sites, but instead they closed down this debate. So you can imagine in the theatre where this debate is about to take place, and next thing people hear the hum of motorcycles downstairs, they hear the clanging of the chains, they hear the knocking of the knuckle dusters as people are marching up to the auditorium. The CFMEU burst through the doors and they close the debate down because they provide their numbers once again to the Leader of the Opposition. Now, what did he have to do to get that deal? What did he have to promise the CFMEU? We will never know, Mr Speaker, unless he is elected as the next Prime Minister. This Leader of the Opposition has more shady figures in his background and in his present than any other former Leader of the Labor Party. Mr Speaker, the fact is that nobody can trust a word that this man utters. He has been involved in ripping off workers. He's been involved, Mr Speaker. It's documented well and truly, Mr Speaker.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of... Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, there was a clear reflection on a member and it should be withdrawn. That should be withdrawn as well.
I didn't hear that, but interjecting while I'm hearing a point of order is particularly disorderly. I was listening carefully. I heard the Minister use a phrase that has been used many times without a point of order before. I don't want to repeat the phrase, but I just make that point. The Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, perhaps it's best summed up by somebody you don't hear from often in this place, but that's the member for Scullin. He's sitting over there in isolation. He's in witness protection, but he said this to The Guardian. He said it was beyond disappointing and that clearly the industrial left and the CFMEU in particular are very focused on supporting Bill Shorten.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. In 2013, the Coalition promised to provide 50% growth funding for hospital services. The government broke that promise, cut its contribution and is now paying only 45%, meaning it is cutting $2.8 billion from hospitals from 2019 to 2025. Why is this Prime Minister giving an $80 billion handout to big business instead of properly funding our hospitals across Australia? Here is your policy, in case you haven't seen it.
The Minister for Health.
Yes.
More cash for the hospital.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And let me start with a single figure, $30 billion. $30 billion is the amount that we are adding to hospital expenditure in Australia. $30 billion. And we go this year from $21 billion to $22 billion to $23 billion and to $24 billion. What we see is from when Labor was last in office, we go from $13 billion to more than double that, to $28 billion by the end of the next hospital funding agreement. There is a 116% increase in hospital funding on our watch. Now that's the reality. But you might want to compare this. You might want to compare and contrast with what is happening in with Labor in Longman. We have mentioned today that whilst we are increasing funding for Metro North, not by 10 or 20, 30 or $40 million, but by $120 million in the last financial year alone. How much did they decrease funding by for Queensland Labor? Not 5, not 10, not 15, not 20, but $21 million they cut from their own hospitals whilst we're increasing by $120 million. Now, it is fascinating, though, it is fascinating that Labor raises this figure, because what we see now is that Labor is walking away from even its own policy on hospital funding, because what we have now is Labor running around the country making little contributions here or there. But there's a simple question. Will they guarantee that every single dollar they have will be allocated under activity-based funding? Will they allocate under activity-based funding? And the answer is they've walked away from their own policy. And at the last election, some in this House may remember, Labor was talking about a figure of $57 billion. And you know what? They turned up to the election with a $2 billion figure and a $55 billion black hole against their own funding. They never funded their own complaints. They never funded the very thing that they implied for many years that they would do. So when it comes down to it, you see what we're doing, $30 billion of additional funding for hospitals in Australia, record funding each year, every state, every territory. And when it comes to Longman and Caboolture, we see that Metro North had a $21 million cut under Queensland Labor, but absolute silence from this opposition.
The member for Moreton. Test for patience most days. The member for Ballarat seeking to table a document.
I've got several documents. The first I'm seeking leave to table is the Coalition's 2013 health policy, which shows the cuts seems to have disappeared off your website.
I'll ask for leave on that. No. Is leave granted? Yes or no? No. The next one.
You've lost it.
Thank you. I've got another document. I seek to leave to table the National Health Funding Pool, which shows the Queensland Government's funding $356 million more than the Commonwealth.
No, the member for Ballarat will not enter into a description
Sorry.
of all of the documents and seek to make, effectively a 90-second statement. Is leave granted?
I thought it was very succinct.
Is there another one?
Yes, there is.
Okay, the member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And again, another document that shows that Queensland is funding.
No, the member for Ballarat is warned and will resume her seat. I'm not even going to ask for leave on that. The member for CALARE.
My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney update the House on how the government's proposed reforms will make the court system easier, faster and cheaper for Australian families during the difficult period of family separation? And what are the dangers of taking a different approach?
The Attorney-General has the call. The member for Cowan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for CALARE for his question and acknowledge that he practised in this area and fully understands the difficulty that people face inside the courts. And, Mr Speaker, it was just last year that a committee of this House made a bipartisan finding with respect to the family court system, that there was overwhelming evidence received highlighting the complexity of navigating multiple jurisdictions and multiple courts within the same jurisdiction. The same committee again considered on a bipartisan basis, quote, that the system of the two federal courts with concurrent jurisdiction should be simplified. And in fact, the overwhelming evidence, Mr Speaker, for the need to reform the present system has been known for well over a decade. And in 2008, a review commissioned by the then Labor government saw the Semple report say to the then Attorney-General Robert McClelland, in fact now Justice McClelland, that, quote, having two independent courts handling largely the same work has created confusion for litigants and that the concurrent jurisdictions has created a number of difficulties. What I wanted to give the House was one example of those sort of difficulties. Last year, there were 20,500 matters listed for final order applications in the two existing courts. Last year there were 1,200 matters, so that represents thousands of individual Australians who are moved from one court to the other. So, for example, if a matter was moved from the Federal Circuit Court to the Family Court, the family waited on average 11 months for that move to take place, and then after 11 months they are literally required to start again in a different court with different rules, different forms, different procedures, different practice directions. In one case, a couple who started in the Federal Circuit Court in July 2015 were transferred to the Family Court nearly 2 years after filing, then 2 months later were sent back to the Federal Circuit Court. Now, can you imagine
can you imagine the difficulties, the unnecessary cost, the burden for that family, not to mention the turmoil and frustration caused to that family in what is most likely one of the most miserable periods as it was of their life? Fixing that problem alone, the transferals between courts, is going to allow us to have hundreds more family law matters dealt with every year inside existing resources. So to address that very serious problem, Mr Speaker, the Turnbull government has announced today the establishment of the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia, one single family law jurisdiction, one single point of entry, a single, more stringent set of initial assessments so that we can triage cases according to a sophisticated measure of their complexity, and the allocation of $4 million to allow the new court to be enabled to lead a process of drafting from scratch all of the new court's rules, processes, practice directions, proceedings, so that we will have a single court with a single point of entry and a vastly improved process for the tens of thousands of Australian families who at the moment are not being served well by existing arrangements.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister choosing to gift $17 billion to the big banks instead of supporting Labor's commitment to invest $10 million for chemotherapy treatment at Caboolture Hospital so that people living on Bribie Island can get the cancer treatment they need far closer to home than being required to travel far greater distances into Brisbane itself?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition likes to talk about tax, but what he has not been straight with Australians about is the fact that his alternative personal income tax plan is going to see many people in Middle Australia, school teachers, crane operators, forklift drivers, pay thousands of dollars more tax.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Moreton will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business, I want to hear without interjection.
Yeah, Speaker, and I respect that normally we allow a preamble. The preamble is dealing with personal tax. The question goes
Manager of Opposition
nowhere
Business,
near it.
Can just pause for a second. The member for Mackellar is warned. The Manager of Opposition Business.
The question deals with two areas of policy. It does touch on company tax and it touches on funding for Caboolture Hospital for chemotherapy treatment. They're the only two issues it covers.
Yes, I'd just like to rule on this point of order before I call the Prime Minister. Whilst generally I allow a preamble and obviously for ministers, including the Prime Minister, to be on the policy topic, I do say to the Prime Minister on this occasion that the question was specifically about company tax and hospital funding, or funding for chemotherapy. So I'd ask the Prime Minister to confine himself to.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the government supports Australia having a competitive company tax rate for the same reason the member for McMahon said in his much-remained book on the subject. He did. He said it was necessary to keep Australian businesses competitive, because if Australian businesses are competitive, then they can create jobs, as they have done, 415,000 jobs last year and over 1 million jobs since the Coalition came into government at the end of 2013. But, Mr Speaker, in terms of Caboolture Hospital, let's not forget this. As the Minister for Health has set out already, the federal government is providing record growth in funding to Metro North hospitals in Brisbane, which includes Caboolture Hospital, when in fact, the state Labor government's funding has been going backwards. And that's the big difference. More dollars from the federal government going into Caboolture Hospital at record levels. And Labor's truck that is going around the Longman electorate saying that the federal government is cutting funding to Caboolture Hospital is a lie, and it doesn't matter how many times that lying truck goes round the block, it will not make that lie a truth.
The member for Canning. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister update the House on the government's recent achievements in naval shipbuilding? How is the government investing to keep the Australian people safe? And when was the last time a government invested in military capability at this scale?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Mr Speaker, thank you for the question to the member for Canning. The last part of his question, Mr Speaker, was when was the last time a government invested in military capability build-up of this scale? And the answer to that is in the Second World War, Mr Speaker. In World War II was the last time that a government invested in the scale that we are investing today.
Wakefield.
This is the biggest build-up of our military capability in over 70 years, Mr Speaker. $200 billion over the next 10 years, giving the safety that we need as a nation, protecting our national interests and using that enormous heft to drive small and medium enterprises, large primes in defence industry, creating innovation, sophisticated jobs, driving advanced manufacturing, Mr Speaker. I'm asked by the member for Canning to update the House on the naval shipbuilding plan, and of course I wouldn't use a prop, Mr Speaker, but I might table a document later in the answer to this question. Only last weekend, Mr Speaker, at 3 a.m. in the morning, in the member for Canning's electorate, Austral launched the first of the Pacific Patrol boats, the Guardian class, Mr Speaker. $335 million. I'll show you in a minute. $335 million program, Mr Speaker, in the member for Canning's electorate, driving jobs, driving growth, to be provided to the South Pacific countries, 21 of them, 12 different South Pacific nations, supporting our allies across the South Pacific as a country the size of Australia should do, Mr Speaker. 400 jobs in the Henderson Maritime Precinct. Mr Speaker, that is the beginning of a 54-vessel project, a 54-vessel program across many decades created by this government. The last ship that would have been built under the Labor Party was the one that we launched at Osborne 2 weeks ago at Osborne, the last of the air warfare destroyers. That was the last ship that would ever have been built if Labor had been re-elected, Mr Speaker, in 2013. The only ship they ever commissioned was the HMAS Choules, which they bought from Britain, Mr Speaker. They brought the Choules from Britain. They didn't invest $1 in any vessel built in an Australian shipyard. We have 54, Mr Speaker. And that Pacific Patrol Boat program, the Guardian class, isn't just creating jobs in Canning. It's also going to be creating jobs in Leichhardt, in the member for Leichhardt's electorate, Mr Speaker, because that's where the deep maintenance will be done. That's worth $400 million over the life of the program in Cairns and $380 million of new infrastructure in Cairns to be able to do that. So we have a national project from Henderson to Cairns, Mr Speaker, launched on Sunday morning at 3 a.m, driving jobs and growth, Mr Speaker. It would have only happened under this government. It is the beginning of a $90 billion naval shipbuilding program, and I table this very
Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister support Labor's commitment to invest $10 million for a chemotherapy treatment service at Caboolture Hospital?
The Prime Minister has the
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question. And I just note, Mr Speaker, that we have record funding from the federal government to the Metro North Hospital network, which includes a 53% increase to local hospitals compared to the level of funding under Labor. Now, that includes Caboolture Hospital. So the claim that Labor is making in the Longman electorate that the government is cutting funding to Caboolture Hospital is a lie. It is an outrageous lie. And what that goes further, Mr Speaker, than simply recording the fact that what Labor is saying is untrue and setting the record straight. What it tells us is a lot about the character of the Labor Party.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, I asked a very specific question. Would the Prime Minister support Labor's commitment for $10 million for a chemotherapy treatment service at Caboolture Hospital? Yes or no?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, I'm just going to rule on that point of order. The question was very specific. The Prime Minister is entitled to a preamble, but he'll need to come to the specific question or complete his answer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the record funding that we're providing to Caboolture Hospital flies in the face of the falsehoods that Labor is spreading around the Longman electorate. There has never been more federal money going to Caboolture Hospital than there is at the moment, and those lies that are being told in Longman speak very profoundly about the character of the Labor Party and its untrustworthy leader.
The member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small and Family Business, the Workplace and Deregulation. Will the minister advise the House of what the government has done to secure the rule of law on Australia's construction sites? Would a different approach achieve the same result?
The Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member from McKellar for his question. And note that around the country, not just in McKellar, in the last 5 years or 4.5 years, 35,000 small and family businesses have opened up in the construction sector, employing more than 200,000 new jobs, creating 200,000 new jobs. Compared to the Labor's last year when in power, 15,600 small and family businesses closed and 14,000 jobs in construction were lost. And that's why we need the ABCC, the Australian Building and Construction Commission. And that's why we've empowered it to keep the rule of law on our building sites. Now, I'm asked the alternatives. I noted with interest on the 17th of May the member for Hunter in a Sky interview said, and I quote, "John Setka has been penalised on numerous occasions. Ask yourself what those prosecutions were for." And he went on to say the history of mankind, now all of our progress has been built on civil disobedience. And I thought, a civil rights activist, John Setka. So I thought I would take the advice of the member for Hunter and I'd check out his record. 59 convictions. And they range across the following: assaulting police 5 times, assault by kicking, classy, 5 times, willful trespass, Mr Speaker, 7 times, resisting arrest 5 times, theft once, attempted theft by deception once, intent to coerce 9 times, coercion 10 times, adverse action once, and he's been jailed twice for contempt of court. And this is the person. This is when the member for Hunter says civil disobedience. I thought Mandela, Martin Luther King, John Setka. No, I don't think so. But this is the person that the Leader of the Opposition has done his secret deal with. And what do they want to do? They want to take the ABCC, the cop off the beat, so their union mates can run riot and put everything at risk that has been created under the last 4.5 years of a coalition government. But for all Mr Setka's shortcomings, of which there are many, when interviewed by Neil Mitchell on the 18th of May, Mitchell asked, and I quote, "Well, John, do you trust Bill Shorten?" And John Setka's response was, "Well, if he becomes Prime Minister, ask me 6 months later." I mean, I don't know. Not even John Setka trusts the Leader of the Opposition. It is not just the people of Australia that have worked the Leader of the Opposition out. It is his union mates who, having done secret deals with him, Mr Speaker, after all that is said and done, still do not trust the Leader of the Opposition. And they are wise to do so. We must make sure he remains the Leader of the Opposition, never Prime Minister of this country.
Unless he's Alberta.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister match Labor's commitment to provide $4.5 million to TasReach Health Services so that sick Tasmanians in the North West and West Coast can get the specialist care they require in their communities instead of being forced to travel to the mainland?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the federal government is providing record funding to Tasmanian hospitals, and indeed the new 5-year agreement from 2020-21 will see Tasmanian hospitals receive an extra $373.6 million, the 5-year total going up to $2.4 billion. And of course, Mr Speaker, that is in addition to the $730 million that was paid to Tasmania, the largest single payment to Tasmania ever from the Commonwealth in single payment in respect of the transfer back to Tasmania of the Mersey
Hospital. The
Prime
Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yeah, direct relevance, like the previous question. TasReach Health Services have nothing to do with hospital funding. It was a very specific question. Will the Prime Minister provide $4.5 million for specialists to provide outreach services so Tasmanians and Braddon don't have to fly to the mainland to get the care that they deserve and require and should get in their own communities?
I take just before I call the Prime Minister, just on the Leader of the Opposition's point of order, it certainly was a question that related to one topic. It was not as specific as the previous question. I'm listening carefully to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Contrary to the lies that are being spread by the Labor Party, the federal government is providing increased and record funding for health right across the nation, whether it is in hospitals, whether it is in pharmaceutical benefits, whether it is in Medicare. And we are able to provide that funding because we have the budget under control, because we are able to bring it back into balance. We're able to put life-saving drugs on the PBS, not like Labor, who had to hold them back because they couldn't afford to put drugs onto the PBS. You know very well you did. You did not. You held them back. It was a disgrace. A disgrace. You should be ashamed of your record. Ashamed of your record. The Labor Party failed Australians on health. They failed them on national security. They failed them on economic management, and they would fail them again were they ever to occupy this side of the chamber.
The member for Barker.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Human Services. Will the Minister update the House on the government's changes to childcare subsidy, and how will this benefit families such as those in my electorate of Barker? Minister, are there differing proposals of which you're aware?
The Minister for Human Services.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Barker for that question. And I'm pleased to advise him that 4,000 families in his electorate will benefit from our changes to childcare and early learning reforms. And importantly, in the electorate of Barker, as in the rest of the country, low and middle income families will be the greatest beneficiaries from this package. Our $2.5 billion investment in the system is going to target support to families earning the least and to families working the most. Now, some of these changes include scrapping the annual rebate for most families, increasing the hourly cap and reducing the 15% withholding rate introduced by Labor in 2011 to 5%. Now, in fact, under our reforms, 1 million Australian families will benefit from these changes. Now, I see the Shadow Minister is interjecting, and I like the Shadow Minister very much. But I did see an interview that she gave just before question time, and she is not very good at maths. She really is not very good at maths, because 1 million families are going to be better off under these changes, and nearly 7,500 families in her own electorate will be better off under these changes.
Member for Kingston.
7,500
member for Kingston will not be provoked.
Own electorate, targeted towards low and middle income families. Now, I was asked by the member for Barker about differing approaches, and that is a good example. Now, when the Labor Party was last in government, we're making changes to drive down the cost of childcare. When the Labor Party was last in government, they made changes that the Productivity Commission highlighted made the cost of childcare actually go up. They withheld 15% of families' childcare benefits and the childcare rebate. But our reforms will mean that Australian families will be able to actually keep more of their money. Our childcare and early learning reforms will ensure Australian families get every cent they're entitled to, and they can have access to this very important services at reduced out-of-pocket expenses. Now, many families will be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars better off. And I'm happy to give the House a couple of real-life examples. A family on $50,000 with both parents working, 2 children aged under 6 in long daycare at 2 days a week at $100 a day will be $2,000 better off. A family on $80,000, both parents working, 2 kids under 6 in long daycare 3 days a week at $100 a day will be $3,000 better off. These are real-life examples about how these reforms are going to improve the lives of Australian families, putting downward pressure on the cost of living, as opposed to Labor's record when they were in office.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister standing in the way of Labor's plan to give 39,000 people in Braddon a tax cut of up to $928 a year, almost double the tax cut they'll get from the government? Why won't this Prime Minister support lower taxes for 10 million Australians, including teachers, nurses, electricians and mechanics, instead of giving an $80 billion tax cut to big business?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure that question wasn't written by Bob Carr. Not even Bob Carr's that stupid, Mr Speaker. I'm sure he's nobody's puppet, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I quote the Leader of the Opposition. You may think this quote was from some time ago. You may think it was maybe back when he was advocating a 3-level tax rate in Australia, when he was an advocate for that, as was the Henry Review. But indeed, this was only in September of last year. This is what he said in Townsville, the Leader of the Labor Party. He said, "I think Australians pay enough tax at the moment." He said, at the moment. I noticed there was a qualifier. He said, I don't believe that another tax is going to be what Australians need or want, qualifier, at this stage, Mr Speaker. That's what he said. He said that before he went and he ripped into retirees when he put a $10.6 billion over just 2 years' tax on retirees, Mr Speaker. What we know about this Leader of the Opposition is he's shifty, Mr Speaker. He is shifty as he will stand there in Townsville and he'll say, I think Australians pay enough tax at the moment, when he knows full well that over the next 10 years, if he were to become Prime Minister, he'll be whacking an extra tax burden on the Australian people of $220 billion. Now, I know the interjection of the member for Sydney, the well-known tax genius and geography expert, Mr Speaker. She has come in here and said, oh, but we're offering a bigger tax relief.
Sydney will cease
let me sum it up for the member for Sydney. Our package is worth $144 billion over 10 years. Yours is worth just $74 billion. $74 billion is less than $144 billion, you genius. Do I need to scribble it out for you? I mean, you got 10 figures. You can start with that, Mr Speaker, the member for Sydney. What we know is on this side of the House, we have delivered a tax plan that benefits all working Australians, Mr Speaker, all of them, dealing with bracket creep, providing relief to low and middle income earners, making sure that everyone from teachers, Mr Speaker, to AFP officers in the future do not face a marginal tax rate of more than 32.5 cents in the dollar. That's what our plan's doing, Mr Speaker. If you're sitting down there in Braddon or up in Longman or Mayo or anywhere else, know this. Under Labor, you will pay more. You'll pay more in tax, you'll be paying more in electricity bills, you'll be paying more on your private health insurance, and under the Coalition, you'll be paying less.
The member for Fairfax.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure and Cities. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is delivering on its national economic plan for jobs and growth through infrastructure investment in urban and regional areas, including how it's benefiting my electorate of Fairfax, and is the Minister aware of any other strategies?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for Fairfax for his question.
Members on both sides. The Minister has the call.
I do thank the member for Fairfax for his question. He has a very strong record of delivering for his constituents when it comes to securing infrastructure commitments for his electorate. We've just seen a commitment for $390 million for the Beerburrum to Nambour rail connection. That's been on the drawing board for many years. It took the member for Fairfax and the member for Fisher and Team LNP, Team Queensland to deliver that outcome, because it is the LNP, Team Queensland, which is delivering infrastructure. The extraordinary range of projects on the Bruce Highway, $831 million for the Bruce Highway Safety Package, $175 million additional funding for black spots, Bruce Highway, Caloundra Road to the Sunshine Motorway. In fact, the LNP Team Queensland is delivering commitments of $15.4 billion between 2013-14 and 2021-22. On the M1 between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, $500 million for 8 Mile Plains to Daisy Hill, $500 million for Varsity Lakes to Tugun. That is the LNP Team Queensland delivering. The member for Brisbane has been responsible for delivering a commitment to $300 million for Brisbane Metro. Cooroy to Curra Section D, the member for Wide Bay, $800 million. And of course, many of these projects are also going to benefit another electorate in Queensland, the electorate of Longman. Indeed, the former member for Longman, before she forgot that she was also a British citizen, the former member for Longman was quoted in the Caboolture Shire Herald as saying that the Beerburrum to Nambour connection was both welcome and important, and she's absolutely right. So, of course, she delivered nothing like the previous LNP member for Longman. Look at what he delivered in terms of mobile base stations, for example, 7 base stations in Longman. And of course in Fairfax, 3 base stations under the Mobile Black Spots program. What, of course, did we get from Labor when it came to mobile black spots in Longman or anywhere else? How many dollars did Labor commit? Zero. How many additional coverage did Labor deliver? Zero. How many new towers did Labor deliver? 0. 000 is a well-known number in telecommunications. It took Labor to turn it into a policy. They're delivering nothing. They're delivering nothing for their constituents. We're delivering. Team LNP delivering.
Thank you. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.